I think the day you pick up your first single-lens reflex camera is the day that something starts to happen. It did for me, and it led to a life's work and a rewarding career. For you, it may be just the start of a rewarding lifelong hobby. It doesn't really matter. The modern SLR is an amazingly versatile tool. It offers us a window to the world by which we can permanently record life that's all around us. But only if we take the time to discover how it really works and how to use it effectively. Only if we take the time to explore the possibilities. I'm Brian Ratty, and that's what this videotape's all about, exploring the possibilities. The program is divided into 3 parts. In the first half hour, we'll cover all the basics: how a camera works, f-stops and shutter speeds, exposure, depth of field, and film. In the second half hour, we'll go beyond the basics and cover techniques that will help you take better pictures. We'll cover lenses, shooting with available light, shooting with flash, we'll look at filters, and cover some techniques for steady shooting. In the final half hour, we'll show you how to take these tools and techniques and apply them to specific shooting situations. We'll cover scene with the camera, candids, the formal portrait, the environmental portrait, and finally, sports and action. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. You know, there's one thing that happens to me all the time. I'll be out shooting somewhere and an amateur photographer will walk over and start a conversation that goes something like this. "Oh, I see you're using a Nikon. I've got a Minolta. It takes pretty good pictures, but do you think Nikon is better?" And he's always a little disappointed with the answer. A Nikon doesn't take better pictures than a Minolta. A Canon doesn't take better pictures than a Ricoh or Pentax or Olympus. They're all equally good. The point is, cameras don't take pictures, people do. So why do so many amateurs persist in believing that if they can only find the right camera system, all their pictures will turn out perfectly every time? Simple: advertising. Open any photography magazine or walk into a camera store like this one, and you can almost hear the manufacturers beating the drums, insisting that their cameras take all the guesswork out of photography. It's only natural. They want you to buy their camera. Don't get me wrong, some of the technological advancements in the SLRs made possible by computer-aided design and microelectronics are really incredible. They really can take a lot of guesswork out of your photography. I'll cover them later in the tape, but for now, let's forget all of that because I want you to think of the camera as just a basic tool. Remember, it doesn't take pictures, you do. A modern SLR camera operates in the very same basic principle as the earliest pinhole cameras, and for that matter, any other camera ever made. I think it helps to think of any camera as a light, tight box with a hole in it. The hole allows a certain amount of light to enter the box for a certain amount of time so it can expose or create an image on a light-sensitive medium we call film. But before that happens, the light is organized or focused by the lens. So let's start with the lens. The lens is basically a metal barrel which contains several glass elements arranged in groups. These elements gather light reflected from the scene you're photographing, focus that light, and deliver it to the surface of the film where it could form the sharpest possible image. The barrel of the lens contains a focusing ring, which allows you to focus on objects near and far, from less than 2 feet away to infinity, for example. When you turn the focusing ring, you are actually moving the glass elements inside the barrel in and out, varying the distance between the lens and the film. Of course, one of the real advantages of an SLR camera is that the image you see in your viewfinder is exactly the same image that the lens sees. When light enters the lens, it's reflected by a mirror up through a prism and out to your eye. And it doesn't really matter which f-stop or aperture you've chosen for your final picture. The image you see in the viewfinder is always at the widest possible aperture of the lens. And this makes it easier for you to focus and compose because the image you're seeing is as bright as possible. When you press the shutter release to make an exposure, you trigger a whole series of events which happen at an amazing speed. First, the lens aperture closes down to the f-stop you've selected. Second, the mirror swings out of the way so that the light can reach the film. It temporarily blocks your view. Third, the shutter opens for the amount of time you've selected and the film is exposed. Fourth, the mirror swings back down, allowing you to see through the viewfinder again. And fifth, your lens aperture returns to wide open. You're ready to focus for your next shot. Now you'll notice that I mentioned f-stops and shutter speeds, probably the most confusing concepts for any photographer who is just starting out. We'll take the mystery out of all that in just a bit. But first, I want to show you an easy and foolproof way to load your film. Some of the newer cameras load automatically, but if you're not lucky enough to have one of those, get in the habit of doing it like this. Hold the camera like this. Open up the back. Take the film cassette. Don't pull out any more film than there is already. Push the tongue of the film into the groove of the take-up spool. Then gently pull the cassette across the back of the camera and drop it into the take-up chamber, there. Now advance the film once and watch it to make sure it's winding onto the take-up spool and that the perforations on the edge are sitting on these little sprocket teeth. Then turn the rewind lever to take up any slack. Now advance the film. Fire the camera, advance again. Fire again. Close the back and advance to number 1. Keep an eye on your rewind knob. If it's turning in the opposite direction of the rewind arrow, your film is loaded and tracking properly. Now, what do f-stops and shutter speeds do? Well, they work together to control the amount of light that reaches your film. An f-stop determines the size of the hole the light passes through, and your shutter speed, the amount of time the light is allowed to reach the film. With the right f-stop and the right shutter speed, your pictures will be correctly exposed, not too light and not too dark. Sounds simple, and it really is. But a lot of people get bogged down right here. And I think the reason they do is because although f-stops and shutter speeds both do the same thing, control exposure, they do it in two completely different ways. Let's start with f-stops. Once again, an f-stop is a hole or aperture in the lens whose size you adjust to let a specific amount of light reach the film. Larger holes pass more light. Smaller holes pass less light. When your lens aperture is wide open, the maximum amount of light is reaching your film, and your f-stop is expressed by a small number. As you begin to close or stop down the lens, less light reaches the film and your f-stop is expressed by larger numbers. This is what confuses so many people. The bigger the hole, the smaller the number. The smaller the hole, the bigger the number. But it does make sense because f-stops aren't really whole numbers but fractions. f8 is really 1 over 8, which is a greater number than f16 or 1 over 16. But all in all, I think it's easier to remember this way. The bigger the number, the smaller the whole. Later, we'll talk about why we would want to use a bigger or smaller whole. But for now, let's look at the second way we can control the amount of light reaching the film, the shutter. On your SLR, the shutter is actually a pair of curtains positioned right in front of the film. The curtains open, allowing light to reach the film, then close at a predetermined time. That's your shutter speed. Shutter speeds like f-stops are also expressed in fractions. The number 15 actually means 1/15 of a second. 30 means 1/30th of a second, twice as fast. 60th is 1/60th of a second, twice as fast again. At the slower shutter speeds, the curtains move separately. Curtain number 1 moves out of the way to open the shutter, and curtain number 2 moves over to close it. But at faster speeds, at 1/125th of a second and higher, the two curtains move together, creating a slit that travels across the film, exposing it from one side to the other. As shutter speeds get faster, the slit gets narrower, allowing less and less light to reach the film. In some cameras, the shutter curtains travel vertically, but it works just the same. Here's a question I've heard more than once. I can use my f-stops to control the amount of light reaching the film, or I can use my shutter speeds. Why do I have to worry about both? The answer, of course, is there's a lot more to good photography than just exposing the film to the right amount of light, and we'll get into that later. But the point here is that the f-stops and shutter speeds always work together. One always affects the other. The light your lens sees is the light that's there. There's only so much of it, and you can't change that. The same thing goes for your film. It's designed to give you a correctly exposed picture if it's exposed to a certain amount of light. No more, no less. And you can't change that either. In other words, you have a constant at each end, and that's why the two adjustments in the middle, f-stops and shutter speeds, must remain in a constant fixed relationship. If you cut down on the amount of light by changing the f-stop to a smaller aperture, you have to compensate by increasing the amount of light by changing to a slower shutter speed. If you increase the amount of light by changing to a bigger aperture, you have to compensate with a faster shutter speed. It's usually called reciprocity, but think of it as a seesaw. Up one f-stop, down one shutter speed. Down two f-stops, up two shutter speeds. You'll get the same exposure at f4 at 1/500th, at f5.6 at 1/250th, at f8 and 1/125th, f11 at 1/60th. Now you're probably saying, Brian, my camera's automatic. It figures out my f-stops and shutter speeds for me. I don't have to worry about all that. Just remember, it may say automatic on your camera, but that doesn't always mean automatically right. I use automatic cameras too, and I'll tell you something. I'm always aware of my f-stop and shutter speeds. I have to be. But you should start thinking that way too, because when you do, you'll be thinking like a photographer. We have seen with the right combination of f-stop and shutter speed, the right amount of light reaches the film and we get a good exposure, one that's not too light or too dark. But how do we know what that right combination is? Use the camera's meter. All modern SLRs have through the lens or TTL light meters built in.
A photoelectric cell or sensor measures the amount of light reflecting off the scene you see in your viewfinder. It converts that information to an f-stop and shutter speed combination and displays that combination in your viewfinder. The meter is saying, I've measured the amount of light and I've computed an f-stop and shutter speed for you. Use them and you should get a good exposure. And you will, most of the time. In fact, in roughly 8 out of 10 situations, you can trust your TTL meter to give you an accurate exposure. With a little bit of experience, you'll learn to identify the situations where you can trust your meter and those situations where you shouldn't trust it. Let's look at some different situations.
No problem with these kind of pictures. The sun is coming from behind the photographer and it's brightly illuminating the entire scene. No large bright areas that can throw the meter off. Not much shadow either. These are the kind of average situations the meter was designed for. No direct sun here, but the light is soft and even with little contrast. The meter has no trouble. But here's a big problem. The meter had no way of knowing that the girl's face is the most important thing in the scene. It measured all the bright light coming from the sky and compensated for it by selecting too small an aperture. The photographer should have opened up about 1.5 stops to expose for the light on her face. This problem had a different cause. A TTL meter is center weighted. That means it computes the exposure by measuring primarily the light it reads in the center of the scene. And since that part's in shadow, the meter compensated by opening up the aperture and overexposing the girl. The photographer should have pointed at a sunlit area where the girl is standing and gotten a reading from that. Then he should have overridden his automatic exposure system by stopping down. Here's a real common one. Large areas of bright sand or snow can really fool your meter. Use a larger aperture, unless you want your subject to be a silhouette.
The point is, you can't always trust your meter completely. So train yourself. Learn to see what the light is doing. Learn to expose for the part of the scene that's the most critical, a person's face or an area where you want to see the most detail. Aim your camera at that part of the scene first and take a reading. If you have an AE system with memory lock, you can use that. If your camera is manual, compensate by adjusting the exposure up or down. And another thing, if the shot's important, bracket your exposures. Most pros do it. Take one shot at the exposure reading you think is correct. Then shoot a second at a lighter exposure and a third at a darker exposure. It's insurance. With color slide film, bracket about 1/2 stop up and 1/2 stop down. With color print film, try a full stop each way. One more thing. I haven't talked about the different types of TTL exposure systems. Basically, there are 4. Manual, that's where the light meter reports the exposure to you and you set both the f-stop and shutter speed. Then there are 3 types of automatic exposure or AE systems: aperture priority, shutter priority, and program mode. Many of the newest cameras incorporate all 3, as well as a manual override to let you select the one that's best for the situation. Consult your owner's manual for the type of metering system your camera uses. You know, people often ask me, Brian, what's the best type of foolproof meter available? Let me show you one. It's accurate, reliable, and it works anywhere in the world. It never goes out of calibration, and it doesn't need any batteries. Chances are you have one in your camera bag right now. And it's right here inside of every box of film you buy.
This simple chart tells me everything I need to know to make accurate exposures with this type of film, under any lighting conditions. Here, for instance, it tells me that in bright or hazy sun at 1/125th of a second, the correct exposure for this film is f11. And there's a little asterisk, down here, a footnote, which tells me that under these conditions, I should open up to f5.6,
for backlit close-ups.
Interesting, isn't it? You can spend a lot of money on a camera because the ads tell you it computes exposure 6 different ways, and it's what you really need. Then you can take that camera on a round-the-world trip and come back with 20 rolls of film, and every single shot is underexposed by 2 f-stops because the exposure system was malfunctioning and you never bothered to question it. If you relied on this and nothing else, that couldn't happen. The point is simple. Learn to know what your exposure should be. It's not that hard. Your camera can help you out. But remember, it's just a tool. You're the one taking the picture.
Let's spend just a moment on depth of field. It's one of the most important tools any photographer has because it allows you to control the amount of sharpness that appears in your finished picture and therefore the overall look of the picture. Here's how it works. When you focus your lens on an object a certain distance away, you create what is called a plane of sharp focus. Theoretically, that means that only objects lying along a perpendicular plane will be perfectly sharp in your finished picture. But when you focus, you also create a zone of acceptable focus, an area beginning at a point between the camera and the focal plane and extending to a point behind the focal plane. Details falling within this zone will be sharp enough so they will appear to be in focus in the finished shot. It is this zone of apparent sharpness that is known as depth of field. At wide open lens apertures, the zone is not very large. But as you begin to close the aperture down, it increases to include objects both closer to the camera and further away. Now these objects will appear sharp in the finished picture. You have increased your depth of field. Of course, the trade-off here is that each time you close down your aperture by 1 stop, you have to compensate. You have to cut the shutter speed in half so the same amount of light will reach the film. And this starts becoming a real factor when you move down into slower shutter speeds. At speeds slower than 1/60th of a second, a little camera shake can ruin an otherwise great shot, unless you use a tripod. And if you're shooting a moving subject at speeds slower than about 1/125th of a second, you run the risk of coming up with a shot that has good depth of field, but otherwise just a blur. Now, it might sound as if I'm saying that a lot of depth of field is always a good thing, and that you should get in the habit of shooting at the slowest possible shutter speed that's safe, so you'll have the maximum amount of depth of field. Well, actually, that's not such a bad idea for maybe 6 out of 10 subjects you'll be shooting. Scenic shots, for instance. But let's look at some subjects where deliberately choosing a shallow depth of field can work to your advantage. This shot was taken with a telephoto lens, f11 at 1/125th of a second. Nice shot, but look how distracting the background is. Too small an aperture, too much depth of field. Here's the same shot at f4 with 1/1/500ths of a second with a shallow depth of field. The background is thrown out of focus. Our attention goes to the girl where it should be. This could be a nice shot too, but the flowers in the foreground are distracting. It's hard for the viewer to decide where his attention should go. At a larger aperture, this same shot becomes a portrait with the out-of-focus flowers adding to the composition. My point is, it pays to experiment with depth of field. And don't just wait until you get your shots back from the color lab. Get in the habit of knowing what your depth of field is before you take the shot. Remember, with an SLR, when you're focusing an image in the viewfinder, your lens is always at its widest aperture, showing you the shallowest possible depth of field. There are a couple of ways you can check on your actual depth of field before you press the shutter. Right on the top of every lens is a depth of field scale. Here it tells me that if my f-stop is f4, the zone of acceptable focus will include everything from about 12 feet from the camera to about 20 feet. With an exposure of f16, my depth of field will include everything from a little over 2 feet to infinity. And here's an easier way. Use the depth of field preview function on your camera. It might be a button you hold in, or yours might be electronic. It doesn't really matter. The preview lets you see exactly what will be sharp in the finished pictures. There's an old saying, film is cheap, so shoot a lot of it. While film isn't as cheap as it used to be, it's still one of the least expensive accessories in your camera bag, and is by far the most important. And yes, you should shoot a lot of it, as much as you can afford. That's the only way you'll learn, the only way you'll improve. Let's talk about the types of film. For practical purposes, there are really only two, positive and negative. Positive films, which are also called reversal type, include all color slide films. Negative films include color print film as well as films for black and white. There's an easy way to spot the difference between a positive film and a negative film. All color slide films have the word chrome in the name. Kodachrome, Ektachrome, Agfachrome, Fujichrome, and so on. All negative color films have the word color in the name. Kodacolor, Ektacolor, Fujicolor, and so on. Simple. You send out a film called chrome, you get back slides. You send out a film called color, and you get back prints made from a negative. So what should you be using, slide film or print film? Well, of course, that depends. Many casual weekend photographers prefer a print film because they find it more convenient. They drop off a roll at the 1 hour photo lab, have a cup of coffee, and get back finished prints, which they can put into an album, pass around at work, or mail off to a relative. On the other hand, most professionals and serious amateurs who shoot a lot of film prefer to shoot in slides. Slides are more economical because you pay for only the shots you want printed from the roll. Slides are more permanent and a good deal easy to catalog and store because with slides your negatives are really positive images, finished pictures that you could see at a glance. But the main reason pros like to work with slide film is because it produces better definition or detail and better color rendition, especially at slower film speeds. A film speed refers to its sensitivity to light and is measured by an ISO or ASA number. The higher the number, the more sensitive or faster the film. When you load a roll of film into your camera, the first thing you have to do is check the ISO or ASA dial and set it for the number that's on the film box. That programs your exposure meter for the speed of that film. Color films are available in speeds from 25 ISO to over 600 ISO. The slower speeds, below 50 ISO, produce the best grain for reproduction of fine detail and the best color rendition. That can be important when you're making large prints from your negative or transparency. But with slow films, even when you have enough light, you're often working with shutter speeds at below the minimum for hand-holding the camera. So you might have to use a tripod, especially if you need to stop down to increase the depth of field. And slow films are usually a bad choice for fast-moving subjects when you want to freeze the action. Medium speed films from 64 to about 150 ISO are a good compromise for most shooting situations. They're easier to handle, yet still produce a very good reproduction of detail and color. High-speed films with ISO ratings from 200 to well over 600 are designed to be used strictly under low light conditions and I recommend that should be the only time you use them. Now, what do these ISO numbers really mean? Is ISO 400 film 4 times more sensitive to light than ISO 100 film, or 4 f-stops faster, or what? Here's an easy way to understand how it works. Each time you move from one ISO number to the next one up, you gain either 1 f-stop or 1 shutter speed. With an ISO 64 film using an f-stop of f5.6 and a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, you get the same exposure as you would using an ISO 100 film at an aperture of f8 at 1/125th of a second. And you'd get the same exposure with an ISO 200 film shot at f11, also at 1/125th of a second. And with 400 ISO film, you'd get that same exposure at f16 at 1/125th of a second. Or, of course, at f8 at 1/250th of a second, and so on. When we go from indoors to outdoors, something happens. The color of the light changes. We don't notice that change because our brain makes an adjustment for it. But color film can't make that adjustment. It sees the color of the light as it actually is. It sees outdoor light with a great deal more blue in it than the light created by a household bulb. And it sees indoor light with a good deal more red in it than the light created by the sun. That's why color film comes in 2 different color balances. Daylight, which is balanced to the light of the sun, and tungsten, balanced to the most common types of indoor lighting. Now, what happens if you're using daylight balanced film outdoors and you want to move indoors and use the same film? You get an off-color result like this, too much red. Use an indoor balanced film outdoors and you get results like this, too much blue. So what's the solution? Well, the first one's obvious. Change to a film balanced for the type of light you know you'll be shooting in. The second solution is not as easy, but you might want to consider it if you're moving in and out a lot and don't want to change film. The solution? Color conversion filters. An ADB filter adds blue to a scene lit by tungsten light. It converts a daylight film to an indoor color balance. An 85A filter adds red and orange, converting indoor films to a daylight color balance. To convert fluorescent light to a daylight balance, use a 30 magenta color correcting filter with daylight film. But here's the easiest solution of all. Use daylight film outdoors. Then when you go indoors, use a flash. Now you're creating your own light, and since your flash is balanced for daylight, you'll never have to change film or bother with filters. One more thing about film. Be good to it if you want it to be good to you. Don't expect it to give you good color if you keep it in your glove compartment for the entire month of August. And when you go through airport security X-ray systems, keep your unexposed film in a separate plastic bag and have it hand-checked. And one more thing, if you're storing color film for months at a time, keep it in your refrigerator. It'll last longer.
In the first part of this tape, we covered all the basics. How the camera works, shutter speeds, f-stop, exposure, depth of field, film, and so forth. And let's suppose you've mastered all these basics, that you understand how your camera works and what it can do. Well, then it's time to discover what you can do. Remember, the camera's just a tool. In this section, we'll cover lens selection, available light, flash, filters, and steady shooting. Chances are, when you bought your first SLR, it came equipped with one of these, a 50mm normal lens. It's a good lens to have because it sees things in a normal perspective, about the way the human eye does, or the way you're seeing me now. But as an all-purpose lens, the 50mm is really a bit of a compromise in the middle.
It's not as good as a wide angle for showing all the detail in a scene like a landscape. And it's not as good as a telephoto lens for isolating a single detail as you would want to do in a portrait. That's why it's really sad that so many people never get beyond the normal lens that came with their camera. Let's take a minute and look at the full range of lenses available in a typical SLR system so that you can get a better idea of what each type of lens does best.
All lenses are rated by three important characteristics. First, focal length. Literally the distance in millimeters between the lens and the film. Wide-angle lenses have a shorter focal length, which is expressed by a smaller number, like 20, 24, and 28. Telephoto lenses have longer focal lengths, expressed by higher numbers, like 105, 135, or 200. Lenses are also rated by their speed, which is their relative ability to gather light. Lens speed is expressed by the f-stop number for the lens when its aperture is wide open. The smaller the number, the faster the lens. Finally, there's the lens's angle of view. It simply means the amount of the scene from left to right, from top to bottom, that the lens takes in at the subject plane. Short focal length lenses take in a lot. They have a wide angle of view. Telephoto lenses take in a lot less, a narrow angle of view.
Now, if you bought all the lenses available for your camera system, you'd be ready for any shooting situation. But let's face it, you'd wind up a good deal poorer and probably develop a sore neck from carrying all this equipment around. Fortunately, there's a way around that. Two ways, in fact. First, the zoom lens. This is my 75 to 200 millimeter. It can take the place of all these lenses, 85, 100, 105, 135, and 200 millimeter, plus all the focal lengths in between. With this zoom lens, my 50 millimeter speed lens, and my 28 millimeter wide angle, I can travel light and I won't miss much. Remember, I said there were two ways you can get around having to buy all these lenses. Well, here's the second, the teleconverter or extender. This one's a ×2 teleconverter, which means it effectively doubles the focal length of whatever lens it is used with. It works like this. If I mount it on my camera body in front of my 50 millimeter lens, it moves the lens away from the film plane, and my 50 millimeter is now a 100 millimeter telephoto. By itself, this zoom lens has a range of 75 to 200 millimeter. But if I add the ×2 teleconverter, the range is now 150 millimeter to 400 millimeters. Now, when you use a ×2 teleconverter, you will get a light loss of about 2 exposure stops. But that's not too much of a problem. Your through-the-lens meter will compensate for the loss. I highly recommend that you pick up a good quality teleconverter and keep it in your bag. But a little warning. Make sure the teleconverter you buy matches up well, both mechanically and optically, with the lenses you plan to use it with. In other words, try it before you buy. I want to leave you with one final thought about lenses. I know I've said quite a bit about lens speed, and I don't want to leave any false impressions, because I think too many beginning photographers place too much emphasis on speed for its own sake. For some reason, they believe that a faster lens is a better lens, but that's not necessarily true. Just because a lens has a maximum aperture of f1.4 does not mean it's a better lens than one with a maximum aperture of f2. All it means is the faster lens can be more useful in low light situations. The problem is too many amateurs buy a speed lens and then go around shooting everything at wide open apertures, even if it means using shutter speeds much faster than they really need. Here's why that's a mistake. All lenses have what's called a range of optimum performance, a range of f-stops where they can be expected to produce the best results in terms of sharpness, color rendition, and so on. And that range of optimum performance is in the middle f-stops,
usually around f5.6 and f8, depending on the lens. The point is that no lens will perform as well at a wide open aperture as it will in the mid-ranges. There's nothing wrong with speed, but use it only when you need to use it.
The word photography comes from the ancient Greek language and literally translated means to write with light. And that's a good definition because light is the essence of all photography. But too many photographers take light for granted. They make sure they have enough light to expose the film, then they turn the back on the sun and click away. And that's a pity because they're missing out on one of the things that makes photography such a joy: the infinite subtleties and possibilities of light. Let's take the sun. You can think of it as just a yellow ball that's conveniently hung up there to throw light on your subject. But if you take the time to really observe sunlight, you will see that there's a lot more to it than that. You can see that throughout the day, throughout the year, the light from the sun is constantly changing. Its color is changing, its direction is changing, and its mood is changing.
Pre-dawn. The light is not coming directly from the sun. It's soft and warm, reflected from the sky. Then the sun rises, a hard and brilliant light that burns away the night shadows on the land. But soon a morning mist covers the sun, diffusing its light. Shadows are weak, and the colors of the land are muted and subtle, a beautiful light for photography. As the mist burns off, the shadows come back, but they're shorter now as the sun climbs through the sky, and the color of the light is cooler with more blue in it. High noon. The sun's directly overhead. The shadows are at their shortest now. The light is harsh and flat, making the land seem featureless, without dimension. For a landscape photographer, it's a good time to put the camera away and rest. The light will be better later on. Then, in the heat of the early afternoon, a thunderstorm. Heavy clouds rise up and partially obscure the sun. The light is dramatic now and changing minute to minute. It's a time of opportunity. Some of the greatest pictures ever taken were taken in stormlight. Later in the afternoon, after the rain, the sky clears once more. The shadows are getting longer, and details of the land begin to take on more form. As the sun sinks close to the horizon, its light passes through more atmosphere. It seems to increase in size, and its light takes on a warm reddish hue. Then it's suddenly over. It's the beginning of dusk, and the world is once again lit by the soft leftover light reflected from the clouds and sky.
I want to give you a few tips about shooting people outdoors under available light.
On a clear day, direct sunlight can be a very harsh and unflattering light, especially for pictures of people. Look at the contrast between light and dark in these pictures taken in bright sunlight. We don't see that contrast with our eyes because they make an adjustment for it. But film, especially color film, can't do that. In this kind of light, there's about a 3 exposure stop difference between the light areas and the shadow areas. Color film doesn't have the latitude to record details in both. So what can you do to soften the contrast? One solution: wait for the light to change or plan to shoot at a time of day when the clouds are overcast to diffuse the hard light of the sun. If you can't do that, move your subject into open shade, where the light is soft and indirect. The third solution, and it's the one I recommend you try, use a reflector. A simple piece of white card will do just fine. Look at these 2 shots. This one without a reflector, and this one with a white card placed on the shadow side to reflect light back into the subject's face.
Of course, there's another way to approach light by creating your own with your flash.
Electronic flash is a compact, convenient, portable light source for lighting nearby subjects. Notice I said nearby. It never ceases to amaze me when I watch a football game and see all those people in the stands firing away their flash units. They're hundreds of feet away from the field, so it's a complete waste of energy. Even a powerful flash unit throws its light no further than about 30 feet. Flash units come in all shapes and sizes, and they all work a little differently. So when it comes to installing batteries and setting up the unit, make sure you carefully follow the instructions provided by the manufacturer. Most of today's SLR cameras automatically set themselves for flash when you attach a dedicated flash unit. But if you have an older camera or flash unit, you have to set a couple of things yourself. Just make sure the camera is set for X-Sync. The X-Sync setting assures you that the shutter will be open when the flash fires. With most SLRs, X-Sync is 1/60th of a second or 1/125th. Although a few of the newer ones will sync for flash at up to 1/2000th. If you shoot at a shutter speed faster than the camera's designated flash sync speed, you'll get results like this, only part of the picture. Now you're ready to attach the flash unit to the camera. On some of the newer cameras, the flash unit is already built in. But with most, you simply slide the flash unit into the camera's hot shoe mount. When the unit is locked into place, the hot shoe automatically connects the flash unit to the camera's flash triggering circuit. If either your camera or flash unit does not have a hot shoe, use one of these, a PC sync cord. You can pick one up at most camera stores. Now turn the unit on. Wait for the ready light, and you're ready to shoot. Almost all of the electronic flash units available today have automatic exposure control. But we'll cover manual exposure first to understand the principles involved. When you fire a flash, it puts out a powerful amount of light for a very brief amount of time, usually less than 1/1000th of a second. That duration of flash becomes your shutter speed, controls the time of exposure. All you have to do is set the lens to the right f-stop. How do you determine the right f-stop? There are two ways. The simplest is by using the exposure calculator here on the back of the flash unit. First, tell the calculator how much light the film you're using needs by setting the calculator's film speed index to the ISO speed of the film you're using. Then focus on your subject. I'll focus on that light stand over there. Now, if I look at the distance scale on my lens barrel, it tells me that I focused on a subject 12 feet away. So I simply look at the scale here on the calculator and find 12 feet. And opposite that, the scale tells me the correct f-stop to use at that distance, f8. And there's another way to determine which f-stop to use, by using the flash's guide number, the power rating provided by the manufacturer. Divide the flash's guide number by your flash to subject distance. If the distance is 10 feet and your guide number is 80, 10 into 80 equals 8. F8 is your f-stop. But what if you're shooting under completely different conditions? Well, then you might have to make an exposure adjustment. For shooting in a very large room or one with dark walls, you have to use more exposure than indicated with the guide number. On the other hand, in a small room with more reflective walls, you'll have to use less exposure than indicated by the guide number. The guide number is no more than that, a guide. With an auto flash, you don't have to worry about the lens to subject distance and guide numbers. Automatic flash units have a built-in sensor that measures the light reflecting from the scene. When it sees enough light to correctly expose the film, it shuts down the flash. Dedicated flash units, the ones produced by camera manufacturers for their cameras, are fully automatic. When you attach these units to the camera, special contacts in the hot shoe automatically set the camera to proper flash sync shutter speed and adjust the flash exposure calculator for the film speed you've set on your camera. Other units are semi-automatic. You have to tell the flash unit's computer what film speed you're using. Then if you look at the calculator in the back of the unit, it'll tell you which f-stop to use with that film speed. Here it's f4, and the auto flash range for that f-stop is 3 feet to 25 feet. Auto exposure flash has come a long way. Some of the dedicated flash units for the new autofocus cameras even send out an infrared beam that lights the subject for the camera to focus on, allowing you to take flash pictures when it's too dark to see to focus. But you can't trust your flash's computer to think of everything. In this shot, the flash's TTL meter read the light reflecting off the flowers in the foreground. It shut down the flash before the subject got enough exposure. The best solution is to avoid foreground objects altogether. Here, the opposite happened. Since most of what the TTL meter saw was the wall in the background, it metered for that, overexposing the subjects. Let's look at some other common problems, the kind photo finishing stores see every day. The ugly shadows that seem to grow out of people's hair. The solution? Move your subject away from the wall. The infamous red eye syndrome. It occurs because the flash unit is too close to the camera lens. The solution? Use a PC cord and hold the flash at arm's length above and to one side of your camera. Shiny surfaces like mirrors will reflect the flash's light right back into your lens. The solution? Choose a different background. Flash exposure is based on a flash to subject distance. You can't properly expose all the subjects in a scene if they are at different distances from the flash unit. The solution? Move the subjects so they are at the same distance from the flash. But even when everything's working for you, a flash unit mounted on your camera can produce a harsh and unnatural looking light, especially for people. Most subjects appear flat and two-dimensional, with hard shadows and details bleached out by the head-on burst of light. But now look what happens if I take the flash off the camera and hold it up and off to one side. An improvement. Now there's some shape to the face. The subject appears more three-dimensional, but it's still a harsh, unflattering light. The solution is to soften or diffuse the light of the flash, and there's a couple of ways to do it. Most flash manufacturers offer diffusion screens that you can clip onto the front of the unit. They'll soften the light a little, but a better solution is to bounce the flash off a low white ceiling. Bounce light has a much softer look, and it fills in the harsh shadows. With bounce light, there will be an exposure loss, but an auto flash will compensate for that. Just make sure that the auto sensor is aimed directly at the subject, not at the ceiling. And with TTL flash metering, you don't even have to worry about that. Look at the difference of these two pictures. They were both shot on a sunny day with the sun coming from behind the subject. In the one on the left, only the light of the sun was used. The face is in shadow. But in the photo on the right, a flash was used as a secondary light to fill in the shadowed face. Quite a difference. When you start experimenting with flash fill, you'll find that you've opened up a lot of new opportunities for new pictures. Photographic filters come in every color of the rainbow and for every conceivable kind of gimmick and special effect. And let's face it, they're tempting. I think that's why so many amateur photographers rush out to buy these so-called creative filter systems. And it's no wonder. The ads for these systems claim, use our filters and your pictures will stand out from the ordinary. Be more creative. But here's the thing about filters. most of them alter reality. And depicting reality is what photography does best. That's why I suggest you be very careful about changing reality, because once you do, you can't get it back. In this shot, no filter was used. The natural color of the setting sun gives the entire scene a predominantly reddish color. And the same scene shot with a red filter in front of the lens. The filter doesn't alter the reality, it merely adds to the red that's already there. A nice effect because it looks natural. But what if we try the same thing here? Get creative and add that same red filter. We get an unnatural looking off-color result. We could get the same thing by just using the wrong kind of film. Skylight and UV filters can be handy to have because they protect the front of the lens from scratches as well as grease and dust. You just screw them onto the front of the lens like this and leave them there. They can also slightly warm up the color of a cloudy day and cut down the effects of haze or dust in the atmosphere. Some professionals swear by these filters, while others don't bother. It's a matter of personal choice. But if you're going to invest in only one filter, I recommend you make it this one, the polarizer. When light rays strike an uneven surface, they reflect back into your lens from more than just one angle. Depending on the angle of the surface they strike, they either reflect back on a line more or less perpendicular to your lens and film, or they scatter off in 1,000 other directions that are not perpendicular to your film. It's these scattered rays that produce what we normally call glare. A polarizing filter reduces glare by filtering out most of these scattered light rays. When you rotate a polarizing filter, you can see the effect right in your viewfinder, without polarization, with polarization. And notice in these shots how the polarizer, by eliminating glare, produces richer, more saturated colors. And in these scenes, how it increases the color contrast by darkening the sky and making the clouds pop out and appear almost three-dimensional. For color work, the polarizer is the only filter you really need. But you might want to try having a little fun with some of the special effects filters. Diffusion filters come in different strengths. They soften a scene by filtering out some of the sharp detail. They're good when you want to create a romantic mood or for glamour shots because they minimize wrinkles and blemishes. Hollywood is big on diffusion filters. You might want to also experiment with a diffusion filter to add an impressionistic feel to your nature shots. You can get the same effect by smearing a little Vaseline in front of your lens, but not on the lens itself. Use a clear glass filter so you can wash it off later. Sparkle filters or star filters take a point of light and convert it into a star with 4, 8, or 16 points. Prism filters multiply an image over and over. A spectacular effect, but it's hard to find too many situations that call for it. So my advice, start with a polarizer. Then invest in other filters like special effect filters only when you have a specific need for them. But first, get comfortable photographing the world as it really is. It's a pretty photogenic place, a place filled with its own natural special effects if you just know where to look. It's hard to improve on reality.
There's a story about the folks at Eastman Kodak who were developing the disc camera a few years ago. They commissioned a major survey. What they wanted to find out was why so many photographers in the amateur market would buy a camera, shoot a few rolls of film, and then give up. Put the camera in a closet and let it collect dust. Well, obviously, the reason was that these people were disappointed with their pictures. They were frustrated. But why? Well, the answer came back. Camera shake. According to the survey, camera shake was far and away the #1 cause of ruined shots. You can avoid camera shake if you just follow a few simple rules. To start with, get in the habit of holding the camera right. For some reason, most people hold the camera like this, with the left hand over the top and the lens sort of dangling between two fingers. It's a bad habit to get into because it gives you very little support. Here's a better way. Left hand under the lens and camera with fingers spread. Cradle the camera and support it with as much of your hands as possible. Brace your elbows against your body. Keep your legs spread apart. And if necessary, brace your body against a solid object. But the most important thing is knowing when you can safely hand-hold and when you can't. Let me give you a couple of rules of thumb. The first rule, hand-holding at a shutter speed at or below 1/30th of a second with any lens is usually asking for trouble. Rule number 2, there's a helpful guide or formula you can use with any lens. The rule goes like this. Take the focal length of the lens you're using and set your shutter speed at the next highest number. That's your minimum. With a 50mm lens, you'll be safe with a shutter speed of 1/160th or faster. With a 135mm lens, use a shutter speed of 1/250th or faster, and so forth. Now what if you apply this rule and it tells you, no, you can't safely handhold a camera under these conditions? That's what your tripod's for. It's the best solution. When it comes to selecting the best field tripod, you'll probably want to make some compromises. You'll want one that's heavy enough to be rigid and sturdy, but not so heavy that you'll start leaving it behind because it's too much of a bother to carry around. You'll want it tall enough to extend to your eye level, but compact enough so that you can fold it up and toss it behind your car seat. And one thing you don't want to compromise on, a good tripod head with controls that allow you to tilt and controls to allow you to pan and to be able to lock it down. And if conditions call for a tripod, they probably also call for a cable release. Attach it to the camera like this and fire the shutter. That way you don't bump the camera at the instant of exposure. But let's say you get caught. You're driving down the road and you see that once-in-a-lifetime shot, and you didn't bring your tripod, and there's not enough light to handhold the camera. So what do? You improvise. You get out of the car and take something soft like a pillow or your coat, bunch it up like this on top of the car, and put your camera on it. Then move things around, level the camera, and compose. Now the camera's steady, as long as you don't touch it. But you didn't bring a cable release either. So again, improvise. Use your camera's automatic timer. Set it. Now the camera has a chance to steady down, and there's the shot. Since you won't always be able to take a tripod along, I recommend that you pick up one of these and keep it in your camera bag. These little mini tripod systems can be bought in most camera stores, and they come in a variety of designs. With this particular one, I can attach it to my car window and shoot from there. Or, extending the legs, I can put it on a picnic table and shoot from the top of the table. Not as versatile as a tripod, and not as easy to use, but I always carry one of these. It's a good feeling to know that no matter what, you can get the shot. And now the last step, taking the basics that we've covered, all the tools and techniques, and applying them to picture-taking situations. That's what we'll do in this last half hour. We'll cover composition, shooting candids, the formal portrait, the environmental portrait, and shooting sports in action. You can take the most expensive camera. You can have all the right lenses. You can even be at the right place at the right time, and it won't mean a thing unless you've trained yourself to see pictures. I think we're all born with that talent, that ability to see pictures. Certainly little children have it. But as we get older, we get distracted by other things, and we lose that fascination with the visual world all around us. And of course, that's too bad, because as a photographer, it's your main job to learn to see.
Take a look at these pictures. They're all of the same ordinary subject, yet each is different from any of the others. Each has a different viewpoint. Each creates a different feeling. Each tells a different story. How can you learn to see pictures, or should I say relearn? By experimenting, by observing, above all, by taking pictures. Take some time out and pick an ordinary subject, like a tree in the park. Start from far off, then move in. Take your time, observe, study. Change to a different lens. Change your angle of view. Take time to observe what's happening with the light, with the shadow. Look for color. Look for details, patterns, and textures. Look for form. Look for lines. Look for color. Wait for the light to change, then look some more.
Now you might be saying, wait a minute, Brian, that's not why I bought my SLR. I don't want to be a Picasso. I want to take snapshots of my dog, my daughter's date, my son's Little League Thanksgiving dinner with the in-laws. I know where to find my pictures. And of course, there's nothing wrong with snapshots. But you have to ask yourself why you spend several $100s on an SLR system if that's all you want to do. I think I know why. You want even your snapshots of family and friends to mean something, to stand out and tell a story. And like it or not, when you put the camera up to your eye, you become the artist, the storyteller. The edges of your viewfinder frame a two-dimensional space, just like an artist's canvas. Only you decide what gets included on that canvas and what doesn't. It's called composition. And good composition means seeing everything in the frame, top to bottom, edge to edge. Not just the main subject, but the foreground and background as well. And it means orchestrating all the elements in the frame so they work together to best tell the story you want to tell, simply and directly. Let's look at these pictures.
Pretty good, but there's a tree growing out of her head. The photographer wasn't concentrating on the background. Double amputation, painful to watch. The photographer was probably concentrating only on the facial expression, not the entire frame. And this is typical. Too much background makes for a dull shot. Move in, fill the frame with your subject. Another one you see a lot. Photographers who shoot everything from their own eye level, standing up, even when their subject is on a completely different eye level. Move the camera down, move in, fill the frame. Could have been a nice portrait, but too much headroom. The viewer's eye wants to just bounce around up in the light area. Anchor the subject in the frame. Force the viewer's eye to go where you want it to go, in this case, the subject's face. This photographer divided the frame into two halves. It's hard for the viewer to know which half he should be interested in. Framing your subject off-center would be more interesting. Same problem here. The horizon cuts the picture in half. This kind of framing is a lot more interesting. And for that matter, so is this.
There are a lot of rules to good composition, but I'll leave that to the art schools. And besides, rules are made to be broken. But here's what I think is important. When you're looking for a composition, look for themes. Visual themes that you can identify and orchestrate in your viewfinder. What sort of themes? It could be almost anything. Lines, shape, pattern, texture, light and shadow, color, or even movement. Let's look at some good compositions and analyze just what it is that makes the pictures work.
Here the line of the road leads our eye into the picture and around the curve, and the windmill rewards the trip. Here the line of the bridge railing leads our eye away from the subject. And here lines are intentionally used to lead our eye in several different directions at once. Shape is the theme here, a simple, straightforward triangle. And notice how it's anchored right to the edges of the frame. Shape again. The pyramid is a visual theme. Not much line or shape here. Color is the theme, and it's enough to carry the composition. This one relies on repetition of form, the same shape used over and over. And here texture is the theme. In this wide-angle shot, the flowers in the extreme foreground push the background even further back. The result, a real feeling of depth.
Now what if you go out and set up your camera and look for that visual theme, but you just can't seem to find it? There's a simple answer: move, turn around. Simply start looking in a new direction. Here's an example. The image you see of me now on your television screen is flat, two-dimensional. Of course, that's because of the background. But if I just walk a few steps over to here, look what happens. The image you're seeing is still flat and two-dimensional, but it doesn't appear that way. The perspective created by the railing creates an illusion of 3 dimensions. Of course, the best way to learn composition is by actually working at it, experimenting, taking a lot of pictures and critiquing your own work. And it doesn't hurt to go to the library, analyze the work of great photographers, and then try some of the same things. You can even learn by watching television, especially the commercials. Some of those commercials cost over $1 million to make, and they have to tell a complete visual story in under 30 seconds. So you can bet the directors are pretty careful about composition. The next time one of the good ones comes on, try analyzing the composition of each scene. Look for what was left in and what was left out. You might learn a few good tricks. People are fascinating. They're the best subjects of all. They have 1,000 different expressions, 1,000 different moods. Every moment, their faces tell a different story. The trick to candid photography is being ready for those moments. Because when you're shooting candids, you're entering into, for a brief time, someone else's world. Usually they're unaware of your camera. Your job is to catch them in the act of being themselves. Finding good subjects for candid shots is not the problem. They're everywhere. The challenge is to capture those subjects successfully on film, because good candid subjects don't wait. They're here one instant and gone the next. So a lot of things have to come together very fast. The right f-stop and shutter speed, the right lens, composition, lighting, in fact, everything we've been working on in this videotape. Having the right equipment helps too. For candids, I sometimes use my autofocus camera with auto exposure. That way I can use the time that would normally take me to focus and check my exposure to concentrate on the subject. Other times I use my manual camera. For most candids, my favorite lens is my 80 to 200 millimeter. It lets me quickly compose without having to physically move in and out. And I can fill the frame without having to move so close that I'll distract my subject. I use my motor drive or auto winder not only because it lets me get off more shots, but also because it keeps my eye in the viewfinder, where I can concentrate on the subject for that brief second it would take me to manually cock the shutter and advance the film. If you're using a manual focus, manual exposure camera like this one, try this trick. Instead of pointing your camera at the subject you're interested in, point it off to one side at a similar subject in the same kind of lighting. Then set your exposure. Make sure your shutter speed is fast enough, at least 1/125th, and roughly focused. At this point, your actual subject won't know what you're up to. Then aim the camera and you're ready to shoot. Now let's go one step further. Suppose you want to tell a whole story with candids for a photo album or a slideshow, a story of a special event, like a birthday, an office party, a family picnic, or a whole vacation.
How do you tell a story with candid pictures? Well, first of all, a story has angles. High angles, low angles, normal angles, wide angles, weird angles. So look for angles. Look for a good wide-angle shot, then move up, move down, move in, keep looking. Move around to the opposite side and shoot a reverse angle. Change to a telephoto. Then move back to the side where you started and see how that looks through a telephoto. Keep looking and keep moving. Because your subject isn't just in front of your camera, it's all around. So move within your subject. Move in 3 dimensions. Look for themes, because a story has visual themes. Action, reaction, interaction, inaction. People making friends for themselves. People making fools of themselves. People just being people. And a story has its moments. So look for moments. And when they happen, be ready. Set your shutter speed and your f-stop ahead of time. Pre-focus. Be ready for the moment, the emotions. Look for atmosphere. Look for details. And look for an ending, because every story has an ending.
Let me get focused here. Oh, that's super. That's just super. You're gonna like that. Okay. Yeah, hold it right there. Super. Okay.
Few tips on shooting portraits. First of all, you really don't need a professional lighting setup like this one. Bouncing your camera's flash off a low white ceiling will work just about as well. With flash, you can handhold the camera. It gives you the freedom to move around. And use a moderate telephoto lens in the 85 to 105 millimeter range. It will give you the least amount of distortion and the most flattering results. And the background is important. It should add to the picture, not distract. You can buy a roll of color seamless background paper like I'm using here in most large photo stores. Or you can improvise at home. But be sure you pose the subject out and away from the background so you don't have to worry about annoying shadows. Then try to make it fun. Get your model good and relaxed, and shoot a variety of poses. Posing the model with shoulders squared and perpendicular to the camera can make her look stiff and unnatural. Instead, try having her turn her shoulders to an angle. It looks more natural. And using a high stool helps because it makes the model appear more alert. Avoid natural cutoff lines like shoulders, elbows, wrists, waist, and knees. Cut off in between those points and let the viewer's imagination fill in the rest. A high camera angle, looking down on your subject, makes her appear shorter, more insignificant, while a low camera angle, looking up, makes her appear taller. Eye level angles are usually the best. The most successful portrait is the one that reveals the most about your subject's character and personality. That's what you want to put on film. And to do it, you have to capture that one moment when it all comes together. So focus on the eyes, that's important. And shoot a lot of film, and bracket your exposures just to be safe. Then when you get the pictures back, pick out the best ones. How many times have you seen shots like these? The typical Instamatic pictures people bring back from their vacations. And they're always the same. There's always someone standing in the middle distance, posing for the camera, with their back to whatever it was they went on vacation to see in the first place. Here's Betty standing in front of the White House. It's not a good shot of Betty because it's not a portrait. And it doesn't do much for the White House either, because it's not really a realistic picture of the White House. Sure, shots like this prove that Betty was actually at the White House, but other than that, they're dull, because they're a compromise. That's why they end up in albums. The point is, when you're shooting people on location in a natural environment, you have to plan your shots. You have to make some choices. First, you have to decide which element you want to emphasize. Do you want the background to say something about your subject? Or do you want to use your subject to say something about the natural surroundings? Each of these photographs is essentially a portrait. The subject predominates, but in each, the natural surroundings are an important element, adding information and interest and affecting the mood. Here, the woman's surroundings tell us that she's a waitress in a hotel. And in this shot, the woman's flower basket and her weary look tells us that she's a street vendor. Here, the little girl's doll completes the composition and adds interest. In this portrait, the gray overcast sky isolates the subject from the background, and its diffused light softens the old woman's features. While here, the deep blue of the sky, along with the modeling of the direct sunlight, creates color contrast and depth. In this shot, a long lens and large aperture were used to throw the flowers in the foreground as well as the trees behind the children out of focus. But in this one, the camera pans with the action at a shutter speed of a 1/15 of a second, blurring both the foreground and the background and creating a sense of movement. In these pictures, shot with a long lens, the people are really in what would normally be background. They're much further from the camera and they occupy a relatively small portion of the frame in relationship to their surroundings. But they still dominate the scene because they're centered in the composition and their faces are visible to the camera. But pictures like these have a completely different feel. Although the people are still the focal point, they don't dominate the scene. Instead, they're actually a part of the scene, acting as an important visual element in the overall composition. This travel picture, for instance, is not about the gondoliers, it's about Venice. The gondoliers are an element in the composition. In this series of glamour shots, the model, as well as her shadow and footprints, become an important part of the overall natural scene.
Want to take good sports pictures? If you do, get as close to the action as you can. Don't expect to get much from the stands. Get down here on the sidelines, eyeball to eyeball with what's happening. A telephoto or zoom lens is the best choice for action because it lets you get even closer where you can isolate individual details. Wide open apertures let you isolate those details even more because a shallower depth of field throws distracting backgrounds out of focus. And a shutter speed of 1/500 or faster will freeze most action. And if you're using shutter speeds this fast, you may, under these conditions, want to use one of the faster films.
When is freezing the action a good idea? For certain sports, the ones that rely on form, like diving or gymnastics, freezing the action is a must. But for sports that rely on speed and movement, very fast shutter speeds, which freeze the action, can actually destroy the feeling of movement by creating a static look. These shots were intentionally shot at slow shutter speeds, a 30th of a second and even longer, and the camera is panning with the action. The subject in the foreground is reasonably sharp, but the movement of the camera and the slow shutter speed throw the background into a blur, enhancing the feeling of speed. In this one, the camera both panned and zoomed at a slow shutter speed to create the impression of intense movement.
When is freezing the action a good idea? You might want to try experimenting with the different effects with different shutter speeds. But whatever you do, when you're shooting action subjects, anticipate, plan your shots, know where the action's going to be, and be ready for it.
I want to get a shot of the car as it comes around the S-turn. So I move in and get prepared. I pre-focus on the asphalt, so I'll be ready when it moves into my frame. There.
That's about it. I've talked long enough. Grab your camera, shoot a lot of film, take a lot of pictures. And above all else, critique your own work. That's how your photography will improve. Good shooting.
We're really excited about a new series of videotapes, the On Assignment series. These 6 90-minute videos were produced exclusively for the serious photographer. We feel they're a must for any photographer's library. I hope you'll get an opportunity to review one in the near future.
The main light source is placed directly in front of the subject's head and at about 30 degrees above its axis. The camera can be aligned along the axis of the light source and of the subject's head so that it is also directly in front, or it can be placed somewhat to one side. The main light casts a small symmetrical shadow under the nose and some subtle shading under the cheekbones. It makes the subject's nose look smaller and minimizes most skin blemishes. Because of the shape of the nose shadow, some people call this butterfly lighting.
You have seen but a few minutes of the over 9 hours of programming contained within the 6 90-minute on-assignment videos. Throughout the series, we have used hundreds of illustrations and demonstrations to make the programs easy to follow and understand. The On Assignment series is the most comprehensive, informational, and classic set of videos ever produced on the subject of photography. Each video sells for $29.95 plus $3 for shipping and handling. Visa and MasterCard accepted. To order the On Assignment videos, please write to Media West Home Video, Post Office Box 4537, Santa Clara, California 95054 0537, or phone our order desk at 1-800-888-TAPE.